What do you see? What is it?
Go tell Aunt Rhody.
We're gonna be a family now that you're here.
Go tell Aunt Rhody.
Where do you think you're going?
Go tell Aunt Rhody that everybody's
Heck of a thing, ain't it? Sure shit beats the hell out of dying.
Of all the titles released this year, perhaps the most surprising is Resident Evil 7. For a game built on scares and shock value, being surprising is a very good thing, especially taking into consideration the fact that it should be familiar fare. It wasn't just a return to form for the venerable survival horror series, but is perhaps one of the most well executed titles of 2017. Considering some very stiff competition is high praise, but definitely well earned. So, I want to take a quick look at what this 7th main entry in the long-running franchise did to bring its brand of survival horror back from the dead, and how this back to basics revaluation could be applied to other franchises. I am GAMESD, and I'm going to explain
Welcome to the family, son.
Think back to what makes the original Resident Evil and its very faithful remake such an effective horror title.
There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Barry, and myself. We don't know where Chris is.
It's not the mad monstrosities, the terrifying firepower, or even the gut-clenching voice acting.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Where Resident Evil succeeds is in the tension it derives from its restrictive design. The early days of the 3D home console era certainly had its share of compromises, where performance and presentation had to be finely balanced. One trick to assure that what you saw was the game looking at its best was locked camera angles and pre-rendered environments. Where Final Fantasy VII and Parasite Eve used this design to create big and lavishly detailed environments to sprawl around, Resident Evil instead honed in on its restrictive nature to create mood and suspense. It isn't just the brooding detail and environmental narrative of the worn-out Spencer mansion that sets this mood. Tight corridors, blind corners, and hidden obstacles can obscure all manner of nasties, and it's this unknown worry that provides the backbone to its scares. Both of these features are then played up with the game's non-linear structure. Familiar haunts can throw in a few new shocks and surprises in return, and the remake in particular asks you to balance additional resources to save yourself from an unwelcome return of the undead. It isn't just the limitation of the camera or your environment that can build tension. Despite stepping into the shoes of a highly trained police officer, you're less than prepared for the job ahead, and a limited inventory space, not to mention the restricted save system and number of safe rooms in the game, means that coming ill-prepared is a mark of death. For one of the PlayStation's early successes, it's surprising just how much the survival horror formula was honed in the original Resident Evil. You only have to look at the barely touched mechanics of its remake to see that it still holds up. Not to mention the countless survival horror titles released since that all pay homage to this original game. Like all horror franchises, however, Resident Evil was a victim of its own success. With each successive sequel, every new Resident Evil game got larger and more bombastic, expanding on the cast of characters and the size of the threat, until scares took a backseat to soap opera drama and blockbuster stakes. It didn't help that as time went on, the restrictive nature of its original design started to butt heads with the action-orientated gameplay it was pivoting towards. Come its fourth main entry, it would take a total evaluation of the series to get it back on track. The bad news was, the restrictive, tension-driven horror was dropped and set-piece-driven action was embraced fully for this new take on Resident Evil. The good news was, it became a masterpiece that set the standard for the third-person shooter. The overwhelming success of Resident Evil 4 had cemented a new identity for the franchise, one built on the backbone on third-person shooting, Hollywood action, and grotesque monster design. And just as before, Capcom had to up the ante for its obvious sequels, at least until it reached a considerable breaking point. Perhaps it was no surprise then that the developers would look to go back to the drawing board for the seventh main entry on what was now a 20-year-old franchise, and re-evaluate the survival horror's prodigal son. Think back to what makes Resident Evil such an effective horror title. Its restrictive nature, driven by claustrophobic environments with overwhelming monsters, a setting that becomes familiar in order to more easily unsettle, and limited inventory, engagement options and player values are some of the key ingredients to the original's well-regarded formula. It's no surprise then that RE7's most successful elements are lifted directly, even in ways you may not expect. The shift to a first-person camera is certainly the title's most striking element, and it's one that informs the design of the entire game. First-person shooters dabble with horror isn't a new concept. You only have to look at Doom to see unfathomable terror from the barrel of a gun. But where this title is a hard FPS with horror elements, Resident Evil 7 is a first-person horror with shooting elements. Guns of course see a return from previous titles, and definitely inform the majority of your engagements. But stepping into the shoes of an untrained civilian, not to mention one who starts the horror in an agitated state that only deteriorates as madness unfolds, does a lot to make this once powerful interface incredibly unsettling. Pitch black surroundings and heavy aiming emulate the feeling of the blind corridors and cumbersome tank controls of the original, though fortunately don't feel at odds with modern design trends. With meagre defense and melee options, combined with your limited infantry and dwindling surprise, sometimes avoiding combat altogether is the only option. Due to having to see everything from a first-person nature, environments and models return to the lavishly detailed nature only hinted at in the first game, but this time, they can be inspected more thoroughly, if not outright picked up and played with. This detail and realism is perhaps best exemplified by the game's inhabitants.
We need to get out of here first. I think it's this way.
Pared down massively from the extended cast of the original games, Resident Evil 7 instead follows the trend of intimate horror by focusing on a small number of individuals connected to the madness unfolding in this new mansion.
Hey, you gotta help me.
Hold on, back up. Now, sir, do you live here?
Your own protagonist certainly packs a lot of personality, despite the fact you'll see the game entirely from their point of view. The subtle animation of their hands and arms, not to mention the small moments of development glimmered from their voice clips, do a lot to ground them. But the stars of Resident Evil 7 have to be the Baker family.
Where am I? What the hell?
Rise and shine, sleepyhead.
From the first game onwards, there has been a trend of humanising the undead horde you're faced against. Whether it's the diary entries gleaned from employees, the miserable backstory and presentation of Lisa Trevor in the Resident Evil remake, the Ganados of Resident Evil 4, a rabid crowd of infected farmers and townspeople that act as simple mobs, or even the weapon-wielding monsters of later games. But it's in the Bakers that we finally realise villains that don't just talk to you, but taunt you, and take almost a sadistic joy in the terror they're committing. You'll be at odds whether to be afraid or entertained by them. And a lot of it is down to the strength of their writing and animation.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna take you for a ride.
They definitely take on new layers once you start to investigate their backstory. And towards the later moments of the title, not to mention its DLC content, that you manage to feel sympathetic for them.
Hey, shh, I know. I'm not gonna hurt you. Hell, I never would have if I could have helped it.
What the?
Though the extended cast of enemies leave a little to be desired, both in regards to their design and intelligence, they're used more as obstacles between your engagements with the Bakers, and each section of the game feels like a chapter dedicated to them. Whether it's the opening moments of unfolding madness with Jack, Marguerite's bug-infested outhouse, Lucas's barn house of death traps and puzzles, not to mention what's left waiting towards the end of the game. This isn't to mention moments broken up by VHX sections that feel like an inspired choice, not to mention a chance to show the game off from another perspective. The game never outstayed its welcome, fortunately, and the escalation feels appropriate for this more grounded take on a series known for its explosive revelations.
All I can say is that if you get this, stay away. Forget that you ever knew me. Have a good life.
Go tell and Rhody.
Ethan.
Go tell and Rhody. Go tell and Rhody that everybody's
Resident Evil 7 definitely carries the spirit of the first game, but it isn't just the reheated cadaver of the PlayStation title. It's small and intimate, but rich with detail and content. It's familiar yet unexpected, and does a lot to upend your expectations of the kind of game you expect it to be. It plays on popular tropes from all aspects of horror media, taking cues from The Evil Dead, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Amnesia, and even Alien Isolation, but manages to combine them all into a package that feels distinct, not to mention one that resonates with the other games in the series. Of all the games I played this year, I wasn't expecting Resident Evil 7 to leave me thinking about it so long past its launch, and if you've yet to play the title, I can't recommend it enough. Despite being around for 2 decades, the game is a great example of how old ideas can be made new again, how the familiar can be made shocking, and just how dead genres can be brought back to life.
Do I have your attention, boy? You're about to see something wonderful. Oh, fuck!
Hello! Thank you for watching and listening. If you want to support the channel or receive notifications of new videos, remember to press the subscribe button. If you want updates on future videos or want to know a bit more about me, follow me on Twitter. And if you'd like to leave any feedback, please leave a comment below. I try and respond to anything you post. And that's all for now. Talk to you soon.